Well, hello again. We are continuing our study in the life of Joseph of the Old Testament. Last time we were together, we looked at Joseph's new life, out of prison, in the palace. Um, he had told Pharaoh what the dreams meant, that God was going to send a famine after a time of plenty, and Pharaoh buys the whole thing and puts um, Joseph in charge of a plan that Joseph initiated with him that would help save his country. And that's where we left it. And today in this study, we're probably going to be between 8 and 10 years later. Joseph now is, his second most powerful man in Egypt, and his plan has been formulated, and he's worked it, and he performed, and Egypt was ready for what was coming, and it does come. So we're going to take a look at this, and he at this point, Joseph goes off onto a new adventure and a new challenge God's going to bring him, because he again comes up meeting with his brothers after all these many years. And we're going to look at how God works at really activating and correcting a seared conscience that's been seared by a lot of guilt. So let's pray. Father, I just thank you for this time again, and thank you for your blessings on us. Father, I just come again praying for your guidance and your healing in this time that we're in. We thank you, the Lord, that you are in control. You are sovereign. Help us to trust that and know that this will end. And Father, I just pray for those out there who are having issues in their lives. You know what those are. Father, I just pray that you will be with them, give them wisdom, guidance, peace, and even, Father, if it's your will, healing. Just pray you'll keep our hearts open this morning as we continue our study with Joseph, and help what we might learn today to be a part of our lives. And it's in your Son's name I pray. If there's one thing about this lesson this morning, it's going to be it's really a lesson on forgiveness. And, one of the greatest struggles in life is to forgive someone who has wronged us. And even though that person has not acknowledged the wrong or even sought forgiveness. But I got to tell you, nowhere in the Bible does it indicate that the willingness to forgive should be predicated on the fact that someone has asked for forgiveness. And of course, Christ was set the example of that when he hung on the cross and cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." One of the greatest temptations is to vindicate ourselves or to retaliate, and it comes when we meet really face to face with someone who has really offended us. At that moment, whether or not we have fully forgiven is really going to be put to the test. When we are separated from a person who's offended us, it's a lot easier to forget the pain and the suffering and the hurt that we've experienced, and we kind of rise above the human tendency to bear a grudge. But boy, when we interface with that person, it seems like all the old memories, all the old pain are revived, and the stuff just seems to naturally bubble up to the surface. Joseph faced that very problem now as we look into chapter 42 of Genesis. His brothers had treated him cruelly, though Joseph was not without fault. He really wasn't. He had a little bit of issues with that. He did not deserve the evil and cruel treatment that he was given. But we've seen now where Joseph's true character is, the kind of man he had become, and it would really wind up being his greatest asset in this latest and probably greatest test that God was about to give him. Joseph held no grudges. He had no desire to get even with his brothers or Potiphar or anybody else. He'd gone beyond that. God had healed him of all that in his heart and in his mind, and he had enabled him to forget of all the pain and trials that had happened both in Egypt and in Canaan. And that's where he is. I want to read to you again from Max Lucado's book. You'll get through it. Again, it's a book on turbulent times for believers, and the fact that we get through this stuff. But he uses also here the story of Joseph as a backdrop. But he says this: Joseph didn't deserve to be abandoned by his brothers. True, he wasn't the easiest guy to live with. He boasted about his dreams, tattled on his siblings. He deserved some of the blame for the family friction. But he certainly didn't deserve to be dumped into a pit, sold to merchants for pocket change. The perpetrators were his 10 older brothers. The 11 sons shared the same dad, same dinner table, and playground. His brothers were supposed to look out for him. Joseph's next of kin were out of line, and his father, well, Jacob was out of touch. With all due respect, the patriarch could have used a course on marriage and family life. Boy, that's true. Mistake number 1, he married a woman he didn't love so he could marry one he did. Mistake number 2, the 2 wives were sisters. Now, that's might as well just toss a lit match into a firecracker stand. Okay, that's the way I look at that. The first sister bore him sons. The second sister bore him none. So to expand his clan, he slept with an assortment of handmaidens and concubines until he had a covey of kids. Rachel, his favorite wife, finally gave birth to Joseph, who became the favorite son. She later died giving birth to a second son, Benjamin, leaving Jacob with a contentious household and a broken heart. And here's the interesting sentence from Lucado. Jacob coped by checking out. And folks, I think that really in today's world, a lot of fathers do the same thing. Nothing's changed. They cope by checking out instead of diving in and trying to fix the problem. Let me finish up here. Initially, Joseph chose not to face his past. By the time he saw his brothers again, Joseph had been prime minister for nearly a decade. He wore a gold chain of gold eagles on his neck. He bore the king's seal. The blood-bedabbled coat of colors had been replaced with the royal robe of the king. The kid from Canaan had come a long way. Joseph could travel everywhere he wanted, yet he chose not to return to Canaan. Assemble an army and settle the score with his brothers. He had the resources. Send for his father, or at least send a message. He'd had 8 years to set the record straight. He knew where to find his family, but he chose not to contact them. He kept family secrets a secret, untouched and untreated. Joseph was content to leave his past in the past, but God was not. And here's a very important thing I want to read to you, and I think you need to really heed this. Restoration matters to God. The healing of the heart involves the healing of the past. So God shook things up. Folks, it's not just about getting your heart fixed and well and healed. As far as God's concerned, He's also interested in the restoration of relationships when and all, if it's ever possible. Restoration of relationships is also very important to Him. I think that was very, very interesting what Lucado said. So, with that said, there's a famine in Canaan. Just as kind of predicted from what Joseph had talked about, the famine was severe, and that's kind of where we are this morning. The next major event in Joseph's life would bring him face to face with his brothers, and with that experience, there came another test of his character. But what makes Joseph such an outstanding example is that he had every opportunity to retaliate. He really did. His brothers, folks, were in bad shape. They were starving to death. They had no choice. And he would be in control, and they would be at his mercy. He was the one who had all the options. And he could send them packing with no food, or he really could have had them executed as spies. He had the power. But how Joseph really faced this confrontation really speaks loud and clear, really, I think, to every Christian who wants to follow in the footsteps of Christ. The famine Joseph predicted came not only to Egypt, but was in all the known world at the time. Canaan was severely affected. And the word began to spread that there was grain in Egypt. Consequently, Jacob, the father, finally has to send his sons to Egypt to buy food. That's how bad it was. Let's look at chapter 42, verses 1 through 7, and see what happens here. So when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, Why do you just keep looking at each other? I thought that's kind of funny. He says, why you guys sitting on your thumbs around here? We've got to get something done. And he continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. So it was pretty severe. And then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send who? Didn't send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons, that's Jacob, were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. 24 years of separation, folks. And God used this famine to bring the sons of Jacob back face to face with the brother that they had truly wronged. I want to read a little bit from Charles Swindoll's book on Joseph. Got some things to say that I think are pretty important. He says this. Look at Joseph's perspective. At this point, he may have been exhausted. First, there had been the distress of building the granaries, as well as planting and rationing during the years of plenty. Now there was a pressure of having to dispense Egypt's stored grain with prudence and equity and wisdom. Every day he faced his own people, plus a parade of people from foreign lands, including this latest travel-worn, ragtag bunch of Hebrews. Since he instantly recognized them and realized they failed to recognize him, he enjoyed a classic opportunity rarely allowed a person with his power given their sordid past. Talk about one's moment. Well, at least they bowed respectfully for him. Then as they stood up and he looked into their faces, he watched them carefully. They were bearded, unlike the clean-shaven Egyptian. They wore the garb of Canaan and spoke the language of his people, the Hebrews. Joseph must have peered at them intently, studied them with his eyes, listened as they spoke, perhaps trying to discern each one's identity. There was no question that these men were his brothers. Man, what a scene, huh? I have often wondered whether perhaps Joseph had been looking for them all along, as the people of the countries poured into Egypt seeking food, that he may have wondered whether someday his own family might appear before him. And finally, there they stood, and the account tells us he recognized them, but he disguised himself. And he spoke harshly to them. I'll bet that was, man, what a moment that was, for sure. It took that long. Look at verse 8. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph sensed they didn't know who he was. Well, why? Well, let's think about this. Joseph was how old when he was thrown in the pit? He was 17. And when they last saw him, he's probably now close to 40. Joseph was still growing up. He would have changed a lot, all right? And all the brothers were all very mature at that time. I would say some of the brothers at this time they're probably pressing their 60s. The youngest ones may have been in their late 40s. So they had matured. They would not have changed much. Would have been minor compared to Joseph's. And the other thing is Joseph looked like an Egyptian. He was clean shaven. His hairstyle was different dress. It would be understandable that they would go in and not recognize him. But to top it all off, what did they think about their brother? Really, in the end, he was dead. He was the last person they would have expected to see alive. They may have thought about him going down to Egypt, but thinking that he was still alive was probably out of the question. Joseph must have had a rush of thoughts and emotions. He probably did. He probably did have an intense desire to disclose himself. I mean, I sure would have. But he wanted to know some things about their attitudes, about their hearts toward God. He wanted to learn some truth about his father, about his little brother. How had they treated Benjamin? And above all, what was things like? And the other thing is, you got to think, folks, that when they came in and bowed down to him, what flashback would Joseph have had right at that moment? Well, let's go back. If you want to go back to chapter 37 real quick, we'll take a look at that. Verse 7, and it says this. We were binding sheaves. This is the scene I had. Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out of the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Boy, don't you think that came rolling across Joseph's mind? For him, it had to have been a moment that's another piece of the puzzle in his life had come together. He was seeing God's hand all over the picture of his life, and amazing sometimes the hindsight God gives us for how he's worked in our lives. Well, seeing what happened that day became a key to unlocking Joseph's understanding regarding why God had allowed him, to be sold into slavery. Remembering those dreams and seeking God's purpose in it all must have really dissipated any possible remote piece of anger that he might have had when he saw him for the first time. Joseph needed some answers. So what does he do? Let's go back to chapter 42. Look at verse 9. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. You know, some people are when we go through this, are going to think, well, wait a minute. This sounds pretty rough. It sure seems to me like maybe Joseph is kind of getting back at him. But you got to remember, Joseph had no intentions of hurting these guys, of doing anything to them whatsoever. His sole purpose was wanting to find out some truth about how they were doing, where they were spiritually, what they still think about what they did to him, how was his father and his dad. He wanted to get all that, I think, without any spin and without going through a lot of lies to find out what the truth was. Okay? And what about the brothers? When he says you're spies, man, they were shocked. All right? And they defend themselves. Look at verses 10 through 12. No, my lord, they answered, your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, he said, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. So, Joseph gets some answers. Look at verse 13. And boy, they were just coming out with all kinds of information. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers. Joseph didn't ask for that. They just handed it out there. The sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Okay? He gets some more answers. Boy, the brothers' hearts must have sunk. You know, when he was talking about this. So, Benjamin, as we shall see, was never allowed to get very far out of the old man's sight. And with Joseph, the Joseph affair, Jacob probably never really trusted his brothers alone with him ever again. So, guilt has a way, folks, of really coming to the surface. And for 24 years, Jacob's sons had apparently kept this awful crime from Jacob. Now, that's quite an accomplishment when you got 10 guys who I don't think really liked each other that much, all right? But whatever happened in that 24-year period, that moment in Joseph's court really had to bring to the surface things that had always still been on their consciences. It just had to be there. And the stuff that they had tried to forget, but now they They were forced to have to think about it. Joseph's next ultimatum threatened them even more. Look at verses 14 through 16. Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here." Boy, did they get into this. "Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put, this is pretty good, pretty good. And what does he do? Look at verse 17. "And he put them all in custody for 3 days." So Joseph decides that he's going to have them all arrested and thrown in the cooler for 3 days until he decides what he wants to do. I bet these guys just really got their attention. Now you got to remember, all the time that these brothers were in front of Joseph, he was listening to their conversations. True, he had an interpreter, but I would guess the interpreter probably couldn't keep up with fast-talking Hebrew language. Joseph could. This would have been interesting, folks. He was speaking to them in Egyptian. He was listening to them in Hebrew, and I can just see his face as he's listening to these brothers go back and banter back and forth. And boy, is he getting all the information he wants. So Joseph decides to test their attitudes toward God. Look at verses 18 through 20. See what it says here. "And on the third day, Joseph said to them, 'Do this, and you will live, for I fear God.'" It's amazing that they didn't catch on because he said, "I fear God." We're talking about the same God, guys. "If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." And this they proceeded to do. So, obviously still not getting the hint from Joseph that God went to work on these other brothers, and their experiences were stirred to see the connection with what was happening to them in Egypt and what they had done to Joseph 21 years before. Their seared consciences, folks, were starting to be bubbled up and be worked on. Look at verse 21. "And then they said to one another, 'Surely we are being punished because of our brother.'" It finally has bubbled up. What they did to him was wrong. Okay? And then Reuben, who was the oldest son, finally comes up, speaks up, and says to the rest of these guys, and really hammers it home. Look at verses 22 through 23. It says this, "Reuben replied, 'Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Didn't I tell you? But you wouldn't listen.'" Now, guys, remember, Joseph is hearing all this, all right? Again, I can just see it just going back. Well, listen to these guys talk. It would have been choice. "But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." Isn't that interesting, folks? He says now. The issue is now we got caught. Things are coming up. Okay? Verse 23. "They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter." Man, oh man. That's really been interesting. Joseph understood everything. He was getting a wealth of information. But seeing a change in their attitude, guys, Joseph is really overcome with emotion. And I would think you'd have to be. They're still his brothers. What a time. What a moment. In verse 24, he turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. And he had Simeon, who was the second oldest brother, taken from them and bound before their eyes. And, it would look like he was going to throw him in a slammer, but he really doesn't. He takes him, I think, to live in his house. But they don't know that. Okay? So Swindoll in his book on Joseph says, dealing with seared consciences, when they people realize that they've really had an issue, that they need to get corrected. He said the first thing they do that happens is that person starts taking responsibility for one's own guilt. And that's very true. These guys did not blame their brother Joseph. We didn't see that anywhere. They didn't diminish the wrong by saying they were too young to know better, because they couldn't. They used the right pronouns when they agreed together that we are responsible for what we did to him. You know, when you've done wrong or someone and haven't gone through the necessary process to make things right with the person and God, when you haven't fully dealt with the transgression, you have become a victim, really, of the very distress that you put that person through, okay? The brother's crime, that's now 24 years old, they still felt the distress of it. They did. And time doesn't erase distress, folks. We know it in our own lives, and we see it in other lives that God puts before us in the Old Testament. David, prime example. When he commits murder, when he has adultery, when he goes through adultery. This is what he says in Psalms 32, 3 through 4. When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. There's guilt. That's what guilt feels like. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. Now I think for believers, that's where we sit, guys. When you are hiding guilty things that you've done in your conscience. My vitality was drained away as with a fever, heat of summer. I don't know who said this next comment, but I think it's true. God does not pay at the end of every day, but at the end he pays. Okay? Sometimes God comes around and we get paid on this lifetime, but folks, I guarantee you know there's a day coming when all issues are going to be resolved, and he will pay. Well, the long-lasting bills that were coming due for Joseph's brothers had showed up, and they finally openly admitted that they were guilty. Joseph wasn't done with them yet, though. It is one thing to admit to guilt when you're caught, but it's a whole other thing to admit to guilt because you're truly sorry for what you've done. And so Joseph cooks up another plan. Look at verse 25 and 26. He just doesn't quite stop with these guys. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to put each man's silver back in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. Okay? And after this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. And I bet it was a pitiful-looking little train going out of there, headed back to Canaan. But the kicker was, folks, that he had secretly had all their money, pitiful money, put back in their bags, all right? And he holds Simeon and sends the other ones packing, puts that little surprise in there. And the brothers' response was, I'm sure, very predictable on that way home. Look at verse 27, 28. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and what happened? And he saw his silver in the mouth of the sack. Can you imagine how that must have felt? Oh, my silver has been returned, he said to his brothers. Here it is in my sack. And my Bible says their hearts sank as they turned to go to each other trembling and said, what is this that who, folks, that God has done to us? Okay? Man, oh man. Man, has it come bubbling up. God was surely involved in this mess. And what were they going to say to the old man when they got home? Were they being forced to fess up for what they had done to Joseph? Would their father let them take Benjamin back to get their brother out of hawk? You know, what would happen when they returned and have to face him? Man, I want to tell you, folks, it had to have been a long, long trip back to Canaan. I don't know how long it took to get home, maybe a couple of weeks. But boy, I bet that was an awful trip. Joseph's brothers found themselves in an awful dilemma, as most people eventually do when they sin and then try to cover it up. It may take years for the results of that sin to come to fruition, but I'm convinced, folks, that for Christians, the screw always does turn with God. It always turns. The longer we live in a situation of unconfessed sin, I think the more complex and complicated the results, okay? Swindoll goes on to say this about reconditioning a seared conscience. The next thing is people begin to start to gain a different perspective of the pain they uh, put out there. When the pain and harm we brought to someone else something begins to change inside of us. And God begins to break the shell, so to speak. We start to realize, what we had done. And the third thing is that we are recipients of undeserved expressions of grace. And this is the one that's most important. Listen, these guys deserve no grain and no money. They did deserve punishment for what they'd done to Joseph. But they wound up with what? Full sacks of grain, their freedom, and all their money. And they deserved it to be, and they deserved to be on Joseph's hit list. But here's the thing, Joseph didn't even have a list, all right? His heart was right with himself and his God, and he demonstrated grace to his brothers and mercy to them as well, okay? So some final thoughts, real quick. When we're wrong, we have got to forgive unconditionally. That's out of Colossians 3:13. That's just what you got to do for it to be true and right. Forgiveness will not always mean that a relationship will be completely restored. And I think that, folks, is so true in family relationships and spousal relationships. Many times, there's just no way of getting it completely restored. That's why, to me, I think the relationships in the family need to be absolutely guarded about what happens. Never let it get to that point. Here's the other thing. We must always question what our motives are when we're saying we want to forgive. The first place to start is in prayer. Not asking for vindication about us, but asking God to help the person and help you with the right attitude and witness to make this real. A true test of our motives, this is interesting, is how much we talk to God about the person and the wrong versus how little we talk to others. I think that's very true. Forgiveness must first begin in your own heart, but you've got to question your motives. Make sure they are right. And the only way you can do that is really with prayer and let God tell you. Okay? Forgive because it is good for you. Not forgiving leads to bitterness that leads to hate, and hate can be the spark for some awful actions that often can never be corrected. You know, and you can probably tell me, well, that's Chichester, that's a lot easier and done. I know it, but God says it doesn't matter. Some of us may get a great test in forgiveness. It just comes, and some of you have already had it. You know what I'm talking about. Corrie ten Boom did. If you recall, she and her sister were thrown in a concentration camp during World War II for harboring Jews. They were harshly treated. The guards were awful to both of them. Her sister dies in the concentration camp. It would take ten Boom years, okay, working on her own heart to totally forgive all those people that had harmed them so badly during that time, okay? But she said this, forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. I think what she was saying, even though your heart is hurting and it hurts to think about things and not even getting close to forgiveness, if you decide in your will that I am going to forgive because that's the right thing to do, you have made the right start. And by doing that, it opens the door for your heart to be healed. You know, C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, which I really recommend, said this, I think one of the greatest and most positive forces in human relationships is the act of forgiveness. He was totally right. You know, if there's someone right now you need to forgive, well, you say, Chichester, you don't understand. You don't know the hurt. Man, this was an awful deal. Yeah, I probably don't. But you know what, folks? I don't matter, really. Tell it to your God and Savior and get His answer. If you need to forgive, you need to do it now. Do it today and end the pain, okay? Let the Holy Spirit fill the gaps in your soul, get your life healthy again. That's where God wants you, and you'll be glad you did. Lucado says this, what good has hatred ever brought? What hope has anger ever created? And what problems have ever been resolved by revenge? Hatred, anger, revenge, folks. They are not good quality things in your life, and they never will be. That's why it was so important to Christ to tell us you've got to forgive if you're going to stay healthy. And that's where God wants us. And with His help and your willingness to choose to do that, we can do the same. Joseph did, we can too. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for Joseph's life. May we try to live a life like he had, a character, Father, that was willing to forgive and forget. Help us to do that, Father, to do the right thing. Pray that you'll be with us throughout this week, guide and direct us in all that we do, that you'll be truly proud of us. And it's in your Son's name I pray. Thank you. Well, we'll see you next week.